وننطلق في الجلسة الثانية لوزارة الخارجية الأمريكية التي ستقوم بإبراز التجربة الأمريكية على الدور التطوعي في الولايات المتحدة من ناحية عدد المتطوعين وعدد المنظمات التطوعية. فليتقدم روبن ييغر.
Thank you. Did I get the earpiece? Yeah. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of a program that talks about a topic that is so important and it is of such interest to me. It's also a pleasure to meet people who are involved in a topic that I didn't realize was as advanced in this region as it is, and it's been a pleasure to learn about that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of the program. Do we have slides? Okay, then I'm going to go without slides. Oh, okay, great. The next one, please. The next one, please. Okay, so I thought we'd start with some vocabulary to make sure that we are all understanding the words the same way. A volunteer is a person who freely offers to take on a responsibility. Volunteerism is the principle of relying on volunteer activity and contributions. The three sectors of the economy that we talk about sometimes are the public sector, which is the government, the private sector, which is business, and the volunteer or third sector, or NGO sector, which is the community. Next slide, please. A formal volunteer is someone who has an agreement with an organization that they will volunteer on an ongoing basis for a certain period of time. They usually have an application, records, training, and they have a supervisor they report to. Informal volunteering is what most of us do for our families, for our neighbors, when you help somebody one time or a few times, but not on an ongoing basis in a formal way. Next slide, please. If you think about the history of the United States, in the early days, there weren't very many people, there were very few towns, there were not many roads, and there wasn't a lot of help. That's okay. No, I'm fine, thank you. So if you look at the map, the star is Jamestown, which was the capital of Virginia. And the colony of Virginia back in 1607 went all the way to what is now Wisconsin and Minnesota, which is about 1,000 miles to the north. And if that area is full of mountains and rivers and lakes and a pretty impassable territory, there was no help. You couldn't go to the government and ask them to help you with a road or a school or a decision or even to make a legal decision for you in most cases. If you went 2 weeks, you would still be in Virginia on the border of what is now Tennessee. And if you went 8 weeks, you would still be in Virginia at that time. And if you went 12 weeks, you would still be in Virginia at that time. So to get to the governor for help was very hard. So the next slide, please. People came to depend on each other. Their communities would pull together and do large projects that took more than one person or one family, and they would do them together and they would take turns helping each other. One such activity was a barn raising. A barn is a large building used for agriculture. And to build a barn, it took many more people than one family. So the people would come together from all over the area. They would build this person's barn, and the next year they'd build someone else's barn. And little by little, the community would help each other and help themselves, and they would get things done. The women would bring food, and there were activities such as this went on for cooking, for sewing projects, for harvest, for building large buildings, and for food preservation activities. Once there were established communities, things could not always be supported by just an employee of the government. So people had to help those small institutions function better. Two examples of that are libraries and fire departments. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, good. So the library would have people that donated the books, that came in and took care of the books, made sure they got put on the shelf the right way, and that had programs to support the visitors to the library. The fire department, the people who actually went out and tried to put out fires, are often volunteers, and even today in the United States of America, almost 70% of the firefighters are volunteers. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So the key to volunteering is to find a need and then find a solution. If you need child care or medical care or meals for emergencies, if you have a disaster such as a flood, some of us are familiar with that from last week in Riyadh, or a large harvest or a food preservation project, helping in public facility to expand the service such as the library or a school, or working for a cause or purpose such as supporting your political point of view or supporting the climate. Almost any profession can also be an example of something that volunteers. For instance, very often in the United States, attorneys, lawyers, provide services on a free basis for clients that they want to support. Either it's an organization they want to support or it's someone who wouldn't have legal representation otherwise. But this can also be accountants, photographers, almost anything, almost any profession can find a way to contribute their talent to the community in a way that they're doing it for free. The first organized and regular volunteers in the society were usually women and children, because there would be projects at school. The older children would help the younger children, or they would help with a playtime. Community projects are done by children, like letter writing or drawing pictures to send to the hospital. And projects at the house of worship, there's often things to do there, with whether it's taking care of children or being in charge of the food, and caring for sick or injured. It's not so long ago that people actually tore up their clothes, rolled the strips up, and sent them to hospitals for bandaging. I've actually been alive at a time when people were tearing up fabric, and not clothes usually, but something else, and making bandages that they could send to soldiers. So volunteerism is part of the American culture. Can I have the next slide, please? According to the Council on Foundations, go ahead, skip that one. One more. Next slide. Okay, according to the Council on Foundations, charitable giving in the United States has strong roots in our religious beliefs, in the history of mutual assistance, in the democratic principles of civic participation, in pluralistic approaches to problem solving, and in American traditions of individual autonomy and limited government. Next slide, please. Former President Jimmy Carter is well known for his volunteer projects, whether it's on behalf of Habitat for Humanity or his own Carter Center. And he feels that participating in a volunteer activity is an important thing that he wants to do to express his faith. So that's an example of what I was speaking about. Next slide, please. Third sector. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the third sector and voluntary organizations in the United States. These are organizations that accomplish the most of their work by the work of volunteers. But the staff members of the organization, the professionals that organize the volunteers and set the schedules and make the agreements, those are usually paid staff, and they're usually professional staff. The government also has placements for volunteers in libraries and schools and hospitals and parks and recreation centers. Management of volunteers and NGOs is now a profession in the United States with advanced university degrees. In the United States, laws determine the rights of volunteers because they are unpaid staff, and they are entitled to the same protections and regulations as paid staff. And so they have to have legal background checks, and they're entitled to due process. If you want to fire a volunteer in the United States, You have to tell them why you want to fire them and make sure that you have grounds for firing them, just as you would an employee in your office that you were paying. The Milano School for New School for Management and Urban Policy is part of the New School, which is a university in New York City. And they have a nonprofit management degree with a focus on 5 critical areas of study. The nonprofit sector, which is the history, roles, and current context of that sector. Analytical thinking skills, management and leadership in the nonprofit sector, funding of nonprofit organizations, and management of resources in the nonprofit sector. Resources in the nonprofit sector being, most importantly, human resources, your volunteers. Best practices in the field of volunteer management, organizational readiness, risk management, developing your volunteer program, finding volunteers, screening, selecting, and matching your volunteers to the right job, training volunteers, support, supervise, and retain your volunteers. Keep them, don't let them go away after 1 or 2 visits. Financial management of your organization, and motivation and recognition of all of your staff, paid and unpaid. Next slide. Oh, benefits of volunteering. Okay, so for volunteers, the reasons to benefit, there are many. First, it helps your mental and emotional health. It helps provide an activity and companionship for people who might not know anyone in the community yet, or who are getting older and don't have a lot of activity, or who don't have a large network of connections in the community. Volunteering often helps build those bridges. It helps them help an important cause, such as hunger or illiteracy, or environment, politics, or maybe supporting a cure for a disease. That provides future job skills, contacts, and experience. For instance, when I was in university studying human development and learning, one of my first courses was called Helping Professions. And for the Helping Professions course, I had to go out and do 30 hours of volunteer project, which meant that I worked, in this case, I worked with the Girl Scouts, the little ones who were 6 years old. And every week in my class, I had to do a report on what I did in my volunteer practice, which was very different from my colleagues who were working in hospitals or centers for the poor people or things like that. But it was a very interesting course for me, and the Girl Scouts were a very interesting part of my learning. It supports your, it provides contact with other groups, cultures, and communities. And I've had a chance to coordinate international youth exchange programs in a couple of different jobs. To bring people from one country to visit the United States, in my case, to help families get that new member for the summer of a Japanese student or a student from another country that's coming to live with them and learn their ways. That changes everybody's life, and it's a very rewarding thing to do. But the families that take on those volunteers, they're volunteers. The families that take on those exchange students, they're volunteers. They're not being paid to do that. But they do learn a lot, and it really does help them open up their perspective of the world. Okay, youth volunteers. All the things I spoke of just a minute ago about the benefits of volunteering apply to youth. But it's also interesting to note that when young people volunteer, they form very positive relationships that help them to be stronger in avoiding risky behaviors. So you can avoid perhaps some of the drug problems or crime problems or antisocial behaviors when you're engaged in a positive way with other people who are engaged in a positive thing, and you're proud of what you're doing, you have respect for yourself and other people. Those are important aspects in helping children, teenagers be strong, and that's one more important part of being a youth volunteer. Role of philanthropy, please. Next one. Next slide. Okay. So Alexis de Tocqueville, a French attorney, toured the young United States in 1835, and he wrote papers about what he observed about the culture. But he said, "I have seen Americans making great and sincere sacrifices for the common good, and 100 times I have noticed that when needs be, they almost always give each other faithful support. Well, that I think is another example of what I spoke about earlier, about when you don't have anyone else to help you, when the government's not strong and nearby, and when there aren't businesses that you can afford to hire, you help each other. And so that's the role of philanthropy in the United States. Volunteer statistics, the next one. In 2013, 62.6 million people in the United States volunteered through a formal organization. That's 25.4% of the adult population in the United States. And even more people volunteer informally. Many schools and universities now require volunteer or community service by students as part of their curriculum, and that could be middle school, high school, or university. Total formal volunteer time, 7.8 billion hours, billion with a B, and estimated value to the economy, $184 billion. To break that down to the next slide, please. I picked the state of Texas because the population is just a little smaller than the population of Saudi Arabia. So in Texas, which has 27.5 million people, 23% of all the residents volunteer. There are 4.65 million volunteers. They contribute $12.7 billion to their economy, and 56.2% of them are engaged in informal volunteer service, helping somebody on an infrequent basis. Next slide. Our leaders endorse volunteering. President Barack Obama launched a website called serve.gov where you can go and find ideas about places you can volunteer. They give an award for volunteers. And they promote National Day of Service and Patriot Day for volunteer projects and services. And he himself volunteers. There he is making sandwiches. Next slide. We have a long history of leaders endorsing volunteering. President Reagan called volunteer work an aspect of our American character that is as fundamental to our way of life as our freedom to speak, assemble, and worship. Next slide. Government has a role in producing all of this volunteer effort. First, the easiest one is giving tax breaks for volunteers. If you are a volunteer and you want to travel to your volunteer work or buy a uniform or have a meal while you're there, you can take that off of your taxes. Companies that provide volunteers in large projects also can take that off of their taxes. But more importantly, you can have a large campaign to recruit volunteers or publicize a program. For instance, during the Second World War, we had food shortages because so much food was being sent to the soldiers. So they encouraged people in their communities to build a garden. It was called a victory garden. And the food could be used in that community, and any that was left over could be sent overseas. So we still have victory gardens. In fact, it's the name of a current television program in the United States about gardening because it became such a part of our culture. Next slide, please. Two more projects that the government supported that I'm aware of. When I was in North Carolina, I worked for the Governor's Office of Citizen Affairs with the statewide coordinator of volunteers for the primary reading program. And that means that we in our office we helped every single school system develop a volunteer program to bring volunteers into the classrooms to spend time reading with children, so that those children got more time and more attention and more practice reading than they would have without the volunteers being there. The overall program was called Adopt a School, and it meant companies or people would find a school and they would form a relationship with that school and help it. A typical one, and it happened a lot in North Carolina that year, was McDonald's would offer certificates for however many books you read. You could come and get a certificate for a free hamburger. So companies support these kinds of efforts in different ways. Another one is cooperative extension, which is part of the university systems in the United States. Cooperative extension is when you say, we want to get this information out into the community. So we're going to have activities for farmers so they learn how to grow better crops. We're going to have activities for homemakers so that they learn better food preservation techniques and better ways to care for their families. And we're going to have activities for children so they learn these activities very young and don't have to wait until they're older and unlearn a bad habit So the 4-H program is the youth version of that, and almost every county in the United States has a 4-H program. The government pays for the coordinators, but the volunteers are all from the community, and the children do volunteer projects that range from county fair to services to hospital or to international programs. And finally, the next one I want to talk about is the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is a program we're very proud of in the United States. President John Kennedy created it in 1961. They determined that they wanted to match adults in the United States who had skills with needs in developing countries. Within 5 years, there were 15,000 Americans serving in 50 countries, and I have a picture there of the first group of volunteers coming off the plane in Ghana. I think it was the slide before this one. Okay, yeah, there they are. All right. Then the two more slides. The Peace Corps, the one that says, we need someone with a good back, a strong stomach, a level head, and a big heart. You can't read that one very well. But that's because when the Peace Corps volunteers go into the communities in the developing countries, they live with the villagers. They live in the same kind of home that the villagers live in. They have a few weeks to become fluent in the language of that country, and then they do a project that supports that country's development. It might be agriculture or community economic development, environment, health, or youth and development. People go for 2 years, and at the end of the 2 years, they're given a stipend of money to help them re-enter the United States because they don't have the right clothes anymore, they don't have a car anymore, they don't have a home anymore, but it's certainly not being paid for their service. It's a small amount of money, comparatively speaking. And we have many people that serve in the Peace Corps continue their interest in international relations and international development by working for organizations such as the State Department. Here in Saudi Arabia, at least in Riyadh, we have at least 6 people right now who are former Peace Corps volunteers who in their early years did this kind of service. 2 of them are here tonight. We have Lincoln Fraser here who served in Bulgaria in teaching English. And we have Ann Shu on the other side in the ladies section who served in Honduras, and she also was working with the public school system. That's just examples of volunteerism that people have performed. The last Peace Corps slide. Okay, I'm sorry these are messed up, but the poster says, put your experience to work where it can do a world of good. And that's because you don't have to go into the Peace Corps when you're 22 or 23 years old. You can go into the Peace Corps at any age, even if you're very experienced. And an example of that would be Lillian Carter, who in 1966, at the age of 68 years old, went to India. She became a Peace Corps volunteer, was trained, and went to India and worked in a clinic with leprosy patients. She had previously been a nurse, and she took that skill to the Peace Corps and used it to help in India. And there's a prize for her, named for her, for volunteers over 50, because we have many that are older people that join the Peace Corps. She's also noteworthy because at the time she joined the Peace Corps, her son was a governor, a state legislator in the state of Georgia, and then he ran for governor, and then he ran for president and was Jimmy Carter. So his mother was a Peace Corps volunteer before he was ever president. Okay, the role of business. The next slide. Okay, business has a role. You have a lot of resources when you're a company, and you can use those resources to support your community's development. It not only helps the community, but it actually helps your company. One of the biggest problems companies face is losing your employees because they're not engaged in the work anymore. But if you have a community that works together and has respect for what they do, often that will make people be more interested in their work, they're more productive, they produce better, and also they stay longer in their jobs. At least this is what we find in the United States. So a volunteer project that your whole company undertakes on an ongoing basis, whether it's one at a time, everybody goes to a school and helps with a math tutoring or being a reader or coaching a sport, or a big project you do at the same time, like helping Habitat for Humanity build a house. This allows an interaction in an informal basis that you would never have in the office. So it keeps employees engaged, it builds camaraderie, it builds a corporate culture of meaningful work. Employees feel like they've been recognized, and they develop a pride and a respect for themselves and for their company and colleagues because of that. There's a lot of discussion and recognition now of the importance of corporate citizenship and corporate social responsibility. Forbes magazine even has a list of the top 100 socially responsible companies. So this is an important thing in the business world in the United States. Think about those skills, the benefits I mentioned about volunteering: emotional health, physical health, help in a cause, developing skills, career advancement, having contact with important networks out in the community, building social cohesion. All of those benefits that we mentioned for volunteers also benefit the company. So how do you volunteer? The next slide, please. All right. First of all, find out what you are interested in and see if you can find a way to make something better or engage in something that you find interesting and that matches your personality and interest and your time. Next slide. And to get the most out of your volunteer work, make sure that your volunteer position is a good fit. Ask questions, make sure you know what's expected. Don't be afraid to make a change if it's not working out for you. If volunteering overseas, pick carefully and enjoy yourself. The other side of all of this is if you're the coordinator of volunteers, you need to make sure that those volunteers ask and get answered questions, know what to expect, can make a change if they need to, can know ahead of time what to expect if they're going overseas or doing something that's very, very different from their normal life, and that they're enjoying themselves. And thank you very much. Any questions? I don't hear any. Any questions? Yeah, I'm finished. Okay. Okay.
نشكر الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية على ما قدمته من تجارب. أما الآن فليتقدم رئيس مجلس إدارة اللجنة الاجتماعية الأستاذ زيد الخمشي لتكريم الوفد. أحد من الحضور، هل يوجد أي أسئلة موجهة للمتحدث؟
Mohammed Yahya al-Belushi from the Kingdom of Bahrain. First of all, I would like to thank you for this nice presentation and the useful presentation, let's say, and we can feel and touch there is a huge volunteer work in the United States, and it goes for the long histories as well. And we can call it is big because it is covering all sectors of the voluntary. I have a question here. My question, maybe it will be within two parts. Let's say, yeah, two parts. There is a number of homeless in the States. What is the voluntary work programs or the responsibility of the organizations of volunteers are taking care to provide, let's say, the good shades, places for such people. This is number one. Number two, what is the programs to be taken for this segment to be under or to involve them in the society and take care of them and make them one of our people in our society. We don't feel, or we don't let them to feel that they are separated segment or they are someone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a great question. A couple of great questions. Well, first of all, I can't pretend that we have the answer to fixing the problem of homeless because we haven't found that yet. We have a lot of people trying very hard. We have government working on that. We have corporate people sometimes helping with that. And we have a lot of volunteers that work in soup kitchens, that hand out food, and that work in shelters, and that try to help people find solutions to their problems, whether maybe it's a substance abuse problem, maybe it's a mental health problem that results from some tragedy that they've experienced. We're not sure, and sometimes it's an economic problem. I mean, one of the things that I'm most proud of is our Habitat for Humanity program, which is now worldwide. And that takes a house, and the people help build it. A lot of people help build that house, and we call it investing in your own future. You build that house, and you have pride in that work, and the house is given to you, but you have to take care of it, and you also have to help build more houses for other people. That is very different than some of the other solutions that were tried in the past, and that one has been successful all around the world, whether it's for economic reasons or because of a physical disaster. As far as the role of volunteers, it just depends. There's a lot of things, little and small and little and big, that people can do, but I don't have a particular answer to that or a list for you right now. I wish we were doing a better job of it. Thank you.